Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Let's Tech About It. Now, the two usual geeks on the show, well, we chat about a lot of things and there's a lot of banter because I'm Ayush in Bombay and then there's Aman all the way in LA.
And I'm not the only one here in LA this time out, because we have a very special guest to talk about a very special topic. It's all electric today. It's, I think, very important to the future of not just tech companies, but I think the future of the world and survival of the world. But not to sound too serious there, I want to introduce you all to Priyankar Balekai. Pri is a fellow Bombayite like Ayush and I, and has
Represent.
Go Bombay.
Go Bombay. But now we're Go LA. But anyways, he has dedicated his career to automobiles and trucks and commercial vehicles, and since the last, maybe 10 years, has dedicated to electrification of vehicles and is currently working with two very, very out there companies called XOS Trucks and GreenPower Motor Company, doing some amazing work in the electric vehicle space. And Pri, it's really great to have you on. You are the expert. We are just the geeks who like talking about stuff, but you're going to actually come in with all the know-how and knowledge that we lack in this space. But it's, I think here in California, Governor Newsom has said that by 2035, all new cars and passenger trucks have to be electric. Now, that's a big deal. And that's going to push things in a direction that it's starting to go, but it's going to make it go a lot faster. And then we know in India as well, they have a similar sort of policy, which is actually even more ambitious than the one here in California, because they've put a deadline of 2030. Now, why don't you talk us through just generally how, your experience coming in from India, and obviously when you started off, it was gas-powered engines, gas-powered vehicles, and now this new push in this electric space. Just talk us through your experience and your journey, if you may.
Certainly. Ayush, Aman, thank you for inviting me. Really excited to be here. This is a topic very near and dear to me. And being in the automotive space and having lived in two of the hubs where this is very important, Mumbai, of course, because of the noise, the pollution, everything, and LA, where is the center of electrification for the world, so to say, knowing CARB and their push for electrification. So I think this is a perfect platform and to talk about this, and I'm really excited. So just to give you a little quick background about my journey. So I moved here in '92, did my engineering here, and then since then I was actually designing diesel engines, because back then electrification wasn't all that much talked about. So it was all about emission controls for diesel engines. So I've worked on several different platforms, worked with Ford, Nissan, and at Navistar, basically designing diesel engines and then diesel trucks in general. And in about 2014, I think I moved to Los Angeles, and as part of taking on a new role at BYD Motors, which is one of the largest electric car manufacturers in the world, electric vehicle manufacturers in the world. They're actually bigger than Tesla in terms of number of vehicles sold. And so they were starting an American division for trucks, and I was leading that effort here in Los Angeles. So that's how I guess got into the electric world, because I could tell that diesels were getting legislated out of business, just like they are now in India. It was already starting here, and I'm like, man, I better make a move. And always, having worked in the emission control side, I knew that there's only so much you can do with fossil burning fuels to clean it up. You have to go zero emissions. So that's how I got started, and it's been an exciting journey, really, having worked for BYD, which is a huge company, to being one of the first leadership uh, people on at XOS when they had just started, along with the co-founders, and starting to build their business and product definition, product strategy, and now GreenPower. I'm kind of involved in a similar capacity in bringing their trucks to the market here, and as well as looking at global markets. So really excited to be here. Thank you, guys.
Absolutely, Pri. Fascinating journey that's been in. And like you said, you're perfectly poised and positioned for this podcast. Actually, you're our ideal guest because you understand everything about Bombay and that journey to LA, and you're a tech geek, right? Let's accept you are a resident tech geek. That's what's gotten you so far in this illustrious career of yours. But it's fascinating that you've been there, Pri, from the dot-com bubble, and then over and into from combustion engines, the move to electric, because now in the narrative, we'll get to how India is approaching it and how China, even Singapore seems to be quite a competitive place for even Indian automakers now in terms of their plans to go electric and their plans to make it a manufacturing hub for electric. But what I find fascinating is that a lot of tech companies, and I've covered tech over the years with organizations, tech companies are making that foray into, electric mobility, electric vehicles, right? That wasn't a traditional thing for a consumer tech or an enterprise tech company to be doing. We had Dyson that was planning to invest in Singapore. Obviously, we've got Huawei announcing a car. There's a ton of these in the US. There's so many two-wheeler, three-wheeler companies out here in India doing some fantastic work. Is this the Tesla effect, Pri?
To some degree, it is, and I think also what happens is, if you really compare the old industry to the electric vehicle industry, there's one major component that changes things, right? It's the diesel powertrain, the gasoline powertrain. And if you look at traditionally what a diesel powertrain, to meet the emission requirements, you required hundreds of millions of dollars investment to differentiate yourself and to meet the emission standards. And I've been there in my journey at Navistar, looking at the engine platforms every year. The amount of changes we were making and the amount of cost we were adding to every engine was it's unfathomable that how you could stay in business and still make money after all the investments you were making, right? And the set of expertise, you won't find that everywhere, right? The set of expertise for diesel engines, So what's happened is, with electrification, motors are used everywhere, batteries are used everywhere, right? There's high power grids everywhere. So the issue is picking out the right componentry and customizing it, also integration, and developing it further to meet the needs, as opposed to starting from a fresh sheet of paper, right? So it's almost that all these, as individual technologies, all these technologies exist. You are now kind of aggregating all these different technologies together, and that allows for novices to come into the space very easily, right? If you have the willingness and some of the expertise, and you're able to use your background in control systems and logic and controllers and things like that, you can do some amazing stuff with it. So it just allows for that space, and everybody else, and for most part, people think that everything is, rest of it is all commodity, right? Which to a certain degree it is, right? I mean, there's not much innovation going to happen in a car suspension or a truck suspension, right? So, I mean, there are experts in those fields that have established themselves for hundreds of years. They know what they're doing. Why would anybody else go there? Go try to recreate something that's there. So it's really this new powertrain technology makes it that much more compelling for people to get into it and try their luck, right? So
Right.
that's where I think where the tech companies are now foraying into this space is just a natural evolution of things. But one of the things I have to, being old automotive guy and looking at some of the tech companies do tend to underestimate the amount of effort, work it takes to put a vehicle out, because
Yeah.
you're basically, if you look at a car or a truck, it's a weapon in the wrong hands, right? And you have to be very careful of how it's designed. I mean, these companies haven't spent, 100 years developing processes and testing methods and tests and, all these different aspects, safety measures, for no reason. It all has some history behind it. So
Yeah.
while you have the technology that makes it very simple to get in, but some of the tribal knowledge is going to be very difficult to get in.
I think
So that's where the differentiation happens.
I think you just put a lot of tech journalists out of a job, because I saw a lot of articles on, by The Verge, and I think other sort of similar tech sort of platforms as to they were questioning or reasoning as to why Apple is going to maybe launch a car very soon. But I think Pri just made
that's telepathy. I was just thinking, look, we're all in 3 different locations at the moment, and I wanted to follow up by asking him, saying, damn, that really glues into and really circles in on our conversation about Apple Car. But that Apple Car conversation's been a rumor for so long, busted so often. But Aman, it kind of answers it, right? Are they setting up with Kia? Are they tying up with another, Detroit car maker? Or are they going, with someone who does something completely different? But I think a lot of things that Pri just mentioned sort of elaborate on that and give you the reasoning why a tech company like Apple would approach that. I think,
and also
I don't want to speculate on that
up.
Apple Car, but yeah.
But and also why they would tie up with the manufacturer, because as Pri mentioned, they need to have some form of experience and knowledge that only a traditional car manufacturer would have. So it makes sense, and obviously Apple, being the biggest tech company in the world, would do something.
So and if you look at history.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry.
If you look at history of Tesla, that's exactly how they did.
Right.
Absolutely. And
they hired Lotus, they hired the best of the best, and then they brought in those expertise.
Right.
And, even though their philosophy was a little different than, most other car companies, like they scrapped the traditional dealer network and everything else. But hey, when you had the backing like they did, in terms of cash, you can do that. Not everybody has that.
And that's interesting you say that, because the counter argument that Aman's talking about, us tech journalists, the counter argument that analysts are making when it comes to, let's just hypothetically speak about Apple, because Tesla is a case anyways, but Apple, and when they're talking about the Apple car, and if they're getting into this space, well, they're saying that Apple, from a brand strategy standpoint and the way they actually position their products, they would not be interested in getting into a space where they have to deal with all the baggage, so to speak. I'm not getting technical there, that a Ford or one of those companies came with. They will have their own philosophy, their own design philosophy, and they'll want to control a lot of that ecosystem as well. So that's the counter argument, I guess, that a lot of them make. But in this, it becomes interesting that when you mention that, there is a case also to be made for car makers with that treasure trove of knowledge and information that they come with, which has been gathered over the years.
And I think you're seeing that with Audi, that in the last, I think, 1 month, they've launched 4 or 5 different electric vehicles. And, I think me as a designer, I kind of hate the way the Tesla interiors look. Like, they just are so boring. I mean, I can take an iPad and just stuck an iPad on the dashboard and call it an interiors. I mean, come on, give me a break there. But I think that's why
you don't like the minimalistic designs.
It's minimal, and I like minimal, but it's not. It still needs to be interesting. I mean, that's just This is actually a good thing here because there was a very interesting article I read here and they compared Range Rovers and Audis with Teslas, and the fact that why are Range Rovers, Audis, and some of the higher end sort of luxury car manufacturers, they get it so right in terms of like cockpit quietness, right? Like the car inside, it's super quiet. You don't get a lot of noise coming in from outside. But Tesla, on the other hand, is very loud. And there was people saying that because Tesla is essentially a software company, they're not a real car manufacturer. They'll just put in software of noise cancellation and block out the outside noise without actually having a good seal on the rims or on the door frames or whatever that is.
See, that's a great example you bring up, Aman, because I spent a lot of time with diesels, and
Right.
the amount of time you spend in NVH, what we call noise, vibration, and harshness of a vehicle, right? And how to quiet that down. You just don't, with a diesel engine, you have a certain frequency, the engine is rotating, the pistons are going up and down, right? And it's not as simple as just putting some noise cancellation, because there's not only the noise, there's the vibration, the harshness that one can feel and hear, right? That has all to be countered. So automotive companies generally they have experts, PhDs after PhDs, just looking at how to attenuate some of these noises, right? And they've now made it a standard. So Audi, the interior is going to be quiet. Every seal, every bit of air coming in through the windows, how the vents are designed, right? Your air vents are designed to ACs and it's all something of an evolution that they've gone through that you just can't, you can't just pick it up overnight, right? So that's where the tie-ups become very critical. So you use the best aspects of what a company has to offer, what their core technology is, and then you use another company that has the core technology, and when the marriage comes together, right? And if it's a good marriage, just like any other, then it works. Otherwise, hey, the babies are not going to be that good looking
Fair
or
enough.
smart or whatever it might be. So,
But you mentioned some of these nitty-gritties, and Aman was talking about some of the design philosophy, and you as someone who understands product, as chief product officer, would understand these things, and you'll pay attention to detail and every minute aspect of it. But now I'm talking about this EV push. Aman mentioned in the beginning when it comes to the US and also in India, two markets that you understand very, very well. We have this electrification EV policy by 2030. I think it's not necessarily a law. So obviously it's a policy, it's a directive in nature. We want manufacturers to start phasing out, the older technologies and move towards it. But, I'll share an experience with you, Pri. The Auto Expo happens every year in Noida, in Greater Noida. And I used to cover it every year, and I went down in 2018, and I think Aman remembers this. Aman, this was the time when I tagged you in that lovely post of a Hot Wheels lookalike car.
Contessa.
And that's perhaps the Contessa that Aman and I, by the way, Pri, as kids in Bombay, we'd seen the Mustang. We'd seen the Mustang in all its splendor, but never on the roads. So we always had a dream that we'll save up with our side hustles, pick up a Contessa, which looked like a good version of a Mustang with its gear shift and everything, and soup it up, pimp that ride up, and make it our sort of Hot Wheels fantasy, which also translates into the original classic Mustang, which Aman and I wanted to take even when we came down to LA. When I visited LA, but. That was actually one of the big things. But the theme in 2018 was going electric. And, I spoke to the guys at Renault, spoke to some of the guys even at Mercedes. Very interesting electric plans that they showcased then, some of them in concepts. And then we also had a very interesting bit of, technology showcased by companies like Ashok Leyland. Ashok Leyland's been trying really hard to tie up. Back then they had this thing where they said, Ayush, look, it's not going to work this bit of charging infrastructure and stuff like that. So what we've done is we're going to get our buses, try battery swapping, and we'll have these stations where every time they're stopping to, instead of refueling, in 5 minutes, swap the battery, get a charge battery and move on. Now I read up that they've tied up, I think, with ABB or one of the others, and now they moved to these TOSA fast charging technology, which is now what they're trying. Yeah. So I just feel like there's so many hiccups along the way. We talk about an EV policy in India, but there's not even... We spoke about hybrid, and hybrid never happened in India. We just skipped this whole stepping stone to EV in India straight into this policy. What are these hurdles or obstacles that you see, especially in developing countries like India, that are holding us back from this technology becoming universal?
So you know what? I'll answer your question starting from a very different viewpoint.
Sure.
Because let's start from a place where it worked, right? Where if you look at a city like Shenzhen in China, overnight, they converted their entire fleet of buses, 16,000 buses, to all electric.
Wow.
They've got 30,000 cabs and police cars and everything converted. And it's all through my old company. I was there when they were delivering something like 5,000 buses to them. The entire our factory, as far as our eyes could go in this town where the factory was, it was only buses lined up, So, but that was a decision the local government made. There was no attention paid to demand and supply and whether meeting. No, we are going to give you the supply, you're going to do this, period. And they put in the charging stations, created the infrastructure, and they converted it. It was a light switch event, right? Just turn everything off one day, turn everything on one day. So it could work. Now, us being in a democracy in both places, right? It kind of adds a new layer of complication because here you have to go through the public opinion. It's public money. It's how you spend it, what happens, what infrastructure projects you get. There's a lot of bureaucracy and everything else. So what's going to end up happening is the private enterprise is going to drive this effort, has to drive this effort now, because so far they have been quiet because there's no infrastructure to support it. But as the private enterprise starts picking up pace, the government is going to have to catch up. The infrastructure piece of it has to come up, right? And so far the conversations what are some of the challenges we've had? Why isn't this all over the place, right? It's very simple. It comes down to economics, right? If you look at a market like India, when I'm looking at trucks, for example, I'll give you a very, which you will completely connect to is India is such an outlier when it comes to power per ton of payload capacity, right? Or what actual payload to how many horsepower the vehicle has. Right? Such a oddball. No other country even comes close. So what in US, for example, you would require a 300, 400 horsepower engine spec minimum to carry a certain load. India does it with 1/4 that, or even less. Okay? Because it all comes down to cost. It's total cost of operation, TCO. So that is the biggest driving factor. And so far what was happening is your electricity could be cheaper than diesel or petrol and from a mileage standpoint, but the initial cost of ownership is so, because of the battery pricing, was so high that you couldn't play in the same market without government incentives, huge, massive incentives, right, to totally offset the cost. So now that the battery pricing has come down, I mean, just over last 2 years, what I've seen, I mean, I'm really surprised at how much it's gone down. I thought it would take a little bit longer, but I was wrong. And it's a good thing, in this case that because it's really, and now is the right time where it's come to a point where there's just enough gap that you need some government help, but you are at a point where just without subsidies, you could almost make the total cost of ownership equal to a diesel powertrain or gasoline powertrain, right? And so that was the missing piece that was keeping the entry into this market, that much more difficult, or making it more difficult for people to get into electrification. And there's obviously the anecdotal, effects of like the range anxiety people
Correct.
have, and those things are going to play, and you have to kind of just overcome those slowly as people start using it. And I think what Indian government, for example, is doing, what the LA or California is doing, are the right things. Like California has said, we're going to start at the ports, right? Because those are the easiest. You can put the infrastructure there. Then they're going to go to refuse trucks, right? Because they all go back to a certain depot. Then delivery trucks, where they all go back to a certain depot. So you can put in infrastructure. You can put in the charging infrastructure there, right? Without having to. So long haul, even in the US, is a long ways away from going all electric, right? But same way in India, now what the local governments are doing with buses. That's where Ashok Leland and these companies are really pioneering that, taking that market in, is because, you know what? It's a bus. It's got to go to a depot eventually, and it's going to have to, and and things like, I don't know how long it'll take, but here, for example, in Long Beach, in certain places here with LA Metro, they're doing inductive charging, right?
Correct.
So they've got plates underneath that when it stops at a depot for like 10 minutes, it's being charged at high DC rates without ever contacting anything, right? So those are all technologies that's being deployed here. Now, so similarly, I think natural evolution will translate that, developing nations will also start having that kind of infrastructure available, and the government is doing their part. They're trying to do it anyhow, and it'll take a little while because the mindset has to change. You can't operate the same way, with the level of bureaucracy and everything else. It's got to happen, and to a certain degree, it's just got to be mandated, like Shenzhen did. That's a great example I always give, that, and if a city can just turn overnight into all electric, right, then what's to stop anybody? What's to stop any city from doing it?
Right.
It's just the will of the government to wanting to do it.
Pri, that actually on that, I had a couple of more questions that I thought about while you were talking. When it comes to the horsepower issue, and we know here in America, people love their pickup trucks and giant SUVs, which obviously means you want 500 and upwards of horsepower, which is going to affect your range and your charging times and things like that. And as you mentioned, in India, it's something I didn't know, actually, that India operates at 1/4 of the horsepower capacity. But does that mean that the actual range could be more? Now, I don't know if the 1/4 is right or wrong. Maybe it's just what India does. But does that mean that could effectively help with range, because the horsepower is less, which means you have less usage of the battery?
It's absolutely. It's a direct translation, right? So there's no, it's laws of physics still apply in India. So,
Yeah.
so,
I guess I
there's
was
no,
paying attention in 12th grade when I was
yeah,
learning physics.
And all the private tuitions Aman was taking as well, might I add.
right,
He took
Which
he
you
exactly.
were
took he took
coming
three
to with
separate
me.
classes.
Don't try to sneak out of that, Ayush. But
Well, it's got to be worth something. You brought him here, right?
yeah,
There you go.
yeah.
So,
One more thing I
but
want. Oh yeah, go
yeah,
ahead. No,
no, I was just going to mention that obviously, yeah. So it does help in the overall range because you're not utilizing. So you can downsize your motor. So you can use and really for this. What's going to happen is the range is not going to increase necessarily. Okay, the cost is going to come down.
got it. It'd be easier to own,
So,
right?
so because you're going to put a smaller battery pack, and what you're going to do is run with a smaller battery pack. And one thing, like if you look at the rickshaws and the two wheelers in India, right? The reason they're kind of making inroads into electrification is because the battery power required is so little, right?
That's
They're
true.
running like literally a 10 horsepower engines at times, which is some of the lawnmowers here have more, more power than the auto rickshaws in India, right? So you require that much less battery power. So that's kind of where this you know how you utilize that uh, disparity between
Right.
power and what's required to where India is today. I think it's going to go to more towards reducing the cost in the battery pack. So that's I think where it's going to be.
But you know
And when the
the
range is required, you could do that too, right?
right. But the infrastructure conversation is, I think, very valid because I never thought about it in the way you explain, where the commercial vehicles, public vehicles like buses and trucks, they all go back to a set, they have a routine almost, right? They go back at the end of the day and they can charge. But when you come to private vehicles, and I think Business Insider, an Indian sort of Indian journalism website, has reported that 1 in 5 electric vehicle owners in California have switched back to gas charging because switched back to gasoline powered cars because of charging issues. And that ties into the infrastructure question, because even in a country like the US and in a city like LA, which is car city, right? It's the capital of cars in the world. And even in a city like ours, people are finding charging hard. So I think there needs to be a push by governance to force public infrastructure for electrification. And this is all very interesting to me because this ties into something that I'm passionate about, which is urban design and how cities have to be designed moving forward, and so that we don't have these giant 4-level parking garages sitting at every other corner. It's such a it just struck me how automobiles and urban design and architecture are actually so connected moving forward. It's
Absolutely. It's the automobile that allowed a lot of this to happen, right? The onset of automobiles was something that allowed this. And going back to your earlier question or comment you made about LA and about 1 in 5 people in electrical vehicle owners in California going back to a gasoline. You have to understand it's a very different market here, right? I mean, you're talking about a $80,000, $60,000 Tesla, you know. Now that a person who can afford that can afford a $20,000 spare car. Okay. Now, so yeah, for convenience, I want to have another car just in case I want to drive more than, or I forgot to charge one day,
right,
right?
right.
In a place like India, when you don't have those resources that easily available, and when you're competing in a market that the first question anybody asks is, what is the mileage your car gives, right? Before anything else is ever asked, right? Now,
कितना देती है कितना देती है
yeah, कितना देती है? Bus. So it becomes a whole different story, right? Where they will, that's where I talk about the private enterprise, because some of the things that have happened in the past 10 years in India has happened even besides the government,
That's true.
in spite of the government. It's pure initiative from the private enterprise that's driven that, right? Similarly, I think it's going to happen here too. If you bring the cost down to parity and you show people, right, people are going to want it, and then they're going to demand the infrastructure, and there's going to be some private enterprise who's going to come and fulfill that demand,
Interesting.
right? So it's a bit of a, who's on first kind of
Yeah.
situation here, but I think with the pricing coming down, that is going to jumpstart things.
You're right, Priya, and I think that's an interesting point, Aman, that Pri makes, that especially because you guys understand Bombay as well, and look, we're going through tough times in a pandemic. Things in India are rough, and although Bombay started off, quite in the thick of things, Delhi seemed okay, but the wave caught up with us, and then there's no comparing, but Delhi's in a much worse state than Bombay now, and experts out here are saying, well, how is Bombay? How has Bombay managed to do it? No, it's not necessarily a government push. Well, the private sector has really come in and sort of sorted things out, at least in Bombay, to a large extent, be it supplies, be it vaccinations, stuff like that. So I think you're right with that. Now, we can go on forever, Free, with this conversation, because when geeks get together, well, they get together. But before we wrap up, there is something that I find very fascinating about your journey. And the journey itself is quite inspiring for a lot of people. We have a lot of young people watching this podcast, listening to this podcast on Spotify, on Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, the like, Aman. That was our plug anyways. Let's Tech Podcast at gmail.com is how they can reach out to us, and Pri. But the last question that I have, and I thought we'll wrap up after that, is that this is a journey where you started off from here in Bombay like us, and you've really built this great career out there, and a reputation where you're one of the most sought after people in the electric space. I'll tell you why. A lot of my friends and a lot of people I know in Bangalore and Hyderabad go down the typical coding route, and then everyone thinks, okay, it's an Infosys or a TCS here, or then we're heading to maybe a Google or a tech, a typical tech company like that over there. You've worked at, you've basically covered the spectrum. What is your message? And I don't want to sound too didactic to the younger people watching, but it's a simple question. What is your message to a lot of guys out here who check your LinkedIn profile and they say, hey, I want to do what Pri does in another 20 years from now? What would you tell them?
Just follow your passion, man. I mean, it's as cliche as it sounds. You know what? I really think that's what I ended up doing. Was I was passionate about cars. I was just like you guys were looking at Contessa. I used to have different cars in my mind, that I used to look up to, and I was always like, okay. And you might have heard of DC.
Dilip Chabria.
Yes,
Yeah.
Dilip Chabria. Yeah. So he was one of our neighbors, right? So I used to see all these modifications, cars that he built, and I was just so fascinated. And I'm like, okay, you know what? I got to do something. I came here actually to become a mechanic, right? And then, but very soon I realized, you know what? I don't want to be fixing cars. I want to be designing them, So I switched over to becoming an engineer. And through that process, of course, I was very adamant that I'm not going to get into any other industry but automotive. And that time, it was the tech boom. It was all software. Every person wanted to be a software engineer. It's the highest paid jobs, the easiest way to get a job, and everything else. But I stuck to my guns. I said, no, that's my passion. If I'm going to do something, it's going to be mechanical engineering, and it's going to be in the automotive space. And that's kind of how I've joined. And, I continued that path. And when I saw the opportunity here to get into electrification, took that because I said, hey, this is what I need to learn about. I've learned enough about diesels now. I need to learn something new. I've got to keep myself relevant, And I was really very interested in how this whole piece of infrastructure also works, with electrification. So kind of did that. And then always having worked for like huge companies like 12 billion, $18 billion companies, going to a company with 5 people, right? A startup. I'm like, I've never done a startup. Hey, let me take a chance, What do I have to lose? I'm sure I can find myself another job if this doesn't work out. And so kind of taking your chances that way. And so you got to follow your passion. If you're happy doing what you're doing, things will fall in place. So, and you know what, if anybody wants to ever reach out in terms of their career and want to I would love to mentor anybody or
So good.
be
That's very kind.
be a sounding board, for anybody who wants to know. Because
Wow.
yeah, I've been fortunate, I've been lucky, but
Pri,
Thank you, Pri. Aman,
that's-
you're gonna put down the
Yeah.
LinkedIn profile for Pri.
I'll put Pri's profile down there, and if anyone wants, please feel free to reach out to him. I'm sure he will be more than happy to guide you, give you advice, as he does so to me. Thank you so much, Pri, for joining us. This has been extremely informative, and we've learned things that we had no idea about. And while Ayush and I will continue our discussion on what my next electric car will be, which I'm quite sure it will be electric because I think it's the way to move forward. And when it comes to India, there's it's a whole different story. But hopefully, maybe it can just be people going into electric as a status symbol. Because I remember a very good friend of Ayush and I, the first question he asked my girlfriend at the time was, "Which cars do you have?" So maybe something like that will push people to go electric. I don't know, but hopefully we know for sure that electric is the future. It's definitely also the present, but it's undoubtedly going to be the future.
It starts from the past. So I sent you a picture,
Yes.
and it's really, electrification is nothing new. It's in the 1918, was the first electric trucks, something like that. We used to have one at XOS, bought at an auction. It was a 1918
Wow.
truck, which was all electric, lead acid batteries, the whole 9 yards. And so it's not something new. We've forgotten about it, right? And then now it's coming back into fashion, and I don't see it going away this time, very easily.
Right,
so it's here to stay.
So
And hey, guys, I'm really proud of you guys for doing this podcast, and
Thank
you guys
you.
are doing a fantastic job. Congratulations, and wish you all the luck. And you have a supporter in me.
Thank you
Thank
so
you, Pri. It
much.
means so much.
On that note, for those of you watching us on YouTube, you guys saw the little image that Pri has sent out there. The first electric, or that's where it started, and it's time to bring it back. So on that note, again, Pri, thank you so much for coming on. We have loved to have you. And for everyone else, our Instagrams are down there. Pri's LinkedIn profile is down below. Thank you for tuning in. And as always, we'll be back very soon with another episode of Let's Tech About It. But until then, goodbye for now.